Welcome and thank you for joining us for another irrigation training series with Jane Irrigation. I'm Richard Restuccia, Director of Water Management Solutions for Jane Irrigation. I've got some really great news for all of you today, something we're certainly excited about. I know you guys are excited about too, or will be once you hear the news. We actually have moved our training series to podcasts now. So you can still get the videos on the web, but you can also find all this good training information on Spotify, Apple, or Google Podcasts now. So I know people are spending a lot of time in their trucks, driving from job to job. They want to be productive. It's stay safe at home time. So I know a lot of people are walking and running. And so now we just have another channel, another way for you to get all our irrigation training series in a really easy manner through these podcasts. I'm really excited about that. I wanted to just share that with you to start with. So today we have a great subject, and it's how do I irrigate that? And it's a great title. I really like that title, Andy. And where it stems from is, many times if you're looking at, a rectangular space of turf in somebody's front yard or in front of their commercial building, there's probably two ways to irrigate that correctly with spray heads, and only two ways. But when it comes to drip irrigation, there's a lot more variables. And in drip irrigation, not only are there more variables, but there's a lot of different products and a lot of different ways to do it. So we often get in these situations where we scratch our heads and we say, how do I irrigate that? So Andy Belingheri, the National Sales Manager for Jane Irrigation, put this together to take a look at some of the really common situations that people sometimes struggle to irrigate. And, we're really fortunate that Andy's doing this because it takes a lot of confidence, it takes a lot of know-how, and it takes a lot of experience. And Andy certainly has all three of those things. Andy's a graduate from BYU out of their horticulture program. After graduation, started working for Valleycrest, went to work as an account manager, working with the crews in the field, managing those crews, promoted up to business development, worked for another contractor before coming to Jane, and moving his way up at Jane now to his national sales manager's position. So a lot of good success there, and we're really happy to have Andy today sharing his experience with us. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Andy.
Well, thank you, Richard. I appreciate that introduction. Good job as always, and congratulations on having these podcasts out on Spotify. I think that's a huge accomplishment, and I can't wait to get out there and listen to some of those in an easier format. So great news there. Thanks. Well, welcome everybody. As Richard said, we're going to discuss how to irrigate some key scenarios in the landscape. And what I thought I would do as far as a format today, we want to run through from kind of the low end, low value aspects of the landscape, starting with annual flowers, things that are easy to replace. And then we'll work our way up through on the high end, high value components of the landscape, and that being trees, and how to irrigate each of those. And we'll take a few steps in between. As always, there's a question, a Q&A button. Feel free to ask questions, and we'll get those answered. However, I wanted to start with, I know this is not quite landscape, but it is a component of some yards, and some people are really interested in, and that's vegetable gardening. And because, I tease when I say this, Jane is not a really into an agriculture. We don't do much. We always talk about landscape, right? I just want to make sure our ag guys are feeling a little bit of love today. And I say that tongue in cheek, but how to irrigate, your vegetable garden. The picture I have here, this is fennel, and this is being irrigated with drip tape. And this is how, if you, I doubt very many people are irrigating their yard this way. If you are, drip tape is a great way to do it. Like I said, this is going to be large agriculture production. If you had a large yard and you're doing kind of a traditional row crop style in your home garden, you could do it that way. But for most of us, we have smaller yards, and the craze lately has been raised garden beds. You go to any nursery, landscape center, and you'll see a lot of these drip irrigation components, and the components to build these beds have, especially this past spring, were hard to find. People have rediscovered gardening in general, not just landscape. And so you have this raised bed style of gardening. And there's a book I read, man, many years ago. It's called Square Foot Gardening. And this guy was a proponent of, you could grow more stuff in less space by, following some practices that he lined out. And so what you end up with is high density plant material in less space. And this will be kind of a repeating theme throughout this presentation today when we talk about density of plant material, spacing, soil type, right? But it rings true for your raised bed style of gardening. So you have, as you can see in this diagram, this illustration comes off our raised bed kit that we sell at Jane. You can see you have a few different ways of doing this. We recommend an emitter line or a point source emitter for these raised beds. Now, if you have like this lower section right here, very, very dense plantings, nothing beats a 6-inch spacing, 1/4-inch emitter line or mini pep line, right? If you have large, maybe tomato plants or plants that maybe you're putting a foot or two apart, maybe you could do a ring of that same emitter line, or you could do a point source emitter. So that becomes the best way, in my opinion, to irrigate these beds. I am a big fan of the mini pep line. I've helped people design beds, and what I'll do is across one of the short ends, I'll put a header of 1/2-inch poly and plug into that the 1/4-inch mini pep line, and I'll run it down the length and bring it back again. And I've helped them create 4-foot by 8-foot beds. And so that you end up with a 16-foot run, which is fine. And you space that out 6 inches. And then in that scenario, you can plant whatever you want anywhere, and you're ensured to have coverage for your vegetables. And so just kind of a summary for your raised garden bed, mini pep line, point source emitters. And you can see on these point source emitters, you can get kind of a stream application or more of a bubbling application. But these would be the products you want for a raised garden bed.
So Andy, I've got a few questions that have come in here. So one is drip tape. A lot of front yards are going to out with the turf and in with food, right? And so would drip tape be applicable in those situations? Why would I want to use drip tape versus emitter line?
Well, so that's a good question. Drip tape is going to be less expensive. It's thinner, less expensive. And so if you had a large area, that's why farms are using drip tape for the cost. But if you had if something in your yard where the amount of material isn't going to be very high, my personal opinion is, and you could do it either way. If it were me, I would go with the emitter line, something that's heavy wall, because the lifespan of that is going to be much longer. It's going to be you get some advantages of pressure compensating emitters. Some of those advantages there. You could certainly use tape, but my preference would be for a smaller area to use the emitter line.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. And then in the raised beds that you showed, nobody's really using a 1/2-inch emitter line in those. You could, and you can do anything you want. I find it very impractical to do. It costs more to do. You can get the same quality and durability in the 1/4-inch emitter line, but when you're working with that tight space, that 4-foot by 8-foot space, that 1/4-inch emitter line is a lot easier to manipulate. Put it where you want it, get it to hold. And think about this, so this diagram doesn't show it, but if I had, again, my header going across the short side, and I had these large loops going back and forth my 1/4-inch emitter line, that's really easy to flip out of the bed. I can amend my soils, in the spring, plant my vegetables, and then flip it back down. That becomes a lot easier to manipulate and a little bit more cost effective than going with the 1/2-inch emitter line. And you could use 1/2-inch emitter line, but I find the 1/4-inch emitter line is a little bit easier to deal with. Yeah, I totally agree, especially that part about being able to lift it out, do whatever I need to do, and then put it back in. It's easy. And do you staple yours down?
I do, absolutely.
Okay, great, thank you.
And this is a perfect segue into the next category. Now we're getting into landscapes here, outside of your yard into commercial landscapes. annual and perennial beds. And I define an annual and perennial. This is something you're rotating, man, maybe up to 6 times a year, at least twice a year. You're doing these color rotations. And the theory here, what we want to do, again, this is mass planting, typical spacings, 4, 6, maybe 8 inches if you're really budget conscious on these annual colors. So with that, what we want to do, the theory in irrigating these is we want to use emitter line to slowly soak the root zone, or drip irrigation, but emitter line is the preference here, to slowly soak the root zone. I see a lot throughout the country, and I still here in Vegas where it becomes especially bad, but I still see people using overhead spray. And when you use overhead spray, you end up damaging the flowers. And you get in areas like Vegas or Phoenix, the water droplets will sit on the flower, and the sun shines, it acts like a magnifying glass and will burn it. Or it will create a lot of weight, and it'll start to make the flowers bend over, tip over or fade. And then you get into the disease introduction. When you have a lot of moisture on the leaves and flowers, that becomes sometimes a breeding ground for some fungus and some different disease that can be introduced into your flower beds. So I would challenge anybody who's using spray now, and I can think of very few exceptions, with succulents being the key exceptions, but I would challenge anybody who's using spray irrigation now for a flower bed to switch to emitter line, and that 1/4 inch emitter line drip irrigation, and applying that to the soil surface rather than to the leaf and flower surface, and watch your flowers improve.
Yeah. So Andy, I could just plug in my 1/4 inch into my old supply line, right? I could cap off all the sprays.
Yep, absolutely.
Plug it in, and then could I just run my 1/4 inch all over this area one time, snake it through there?
Well, so good question, right? So again, we come back to this similar theme, right? We're going to see some themes building upon each other, but going back to our vegetable bed, that raised garden bed, if we follow that same principle to an annual bed, which could be different shape, it may not be square, it could be kidney bean. You have that header, like you talked about, right? And then we put we plug in that 1/4 inch emitter line, and we go back to this flip out design, right? And the way that looks, if you look at this here, with the header, right, running across the bottom, here's your black line, here's your header across the bottom, and then here's the loops. Now, you bring up a good question, Richard. Can I just plug this in once and run a 500-foot roll everywhere? The answer is no. When you get into the engineering of irrigation tubing, you can't run that many feet of 1/4 inch line. The rule of thumb, if you follow this, you'll be safe. If you're going to loop it like this, and you have 6 inch spacing, don't exceed 20 feet. And 20 feet, that's a good number to stick to. Now, 12 inch spacing, you can go up to 30 feet. That's just the way it works out. But 6 inch spacing, I like to stick to that because of the tight plant spacing, and I like to loop each one. And as long as your run doesn't go beyond 20 feet, you'll be safe. So I'm going to anticipate your next question, right? What if I have to run longer than 20 feet? What do I do? Well, then it becomes practical, and it makes sense to go from 1/4 inch emitter line up to a 1/2 inch emitter line design, because you can get those longer runs, just the hydraulics, right? The engineering involved in the tubing. But you could also segment your flower bed with different headers. You could put a header on each end and meet in the middle. So there's different ways you can design. Again, when it comes to annual flower installation and a commercial landscape, I like this flip out design, because if I'm rotating my flowers 4 times a year. Every time I do that, because I say I do it in my proposal because it makes me a better contractor, I'm adding organic amendments into the soil. I'm adding fertilizer to really get a good, strong flower display. And it makes it a lot easier to flip that irrigation out, use a spade or a little tiller to incorporate that organic material, lay the irrigation back down with a staple, and plant the flowers that way.
Yeah. So Andy, one more question, and that is, so why 20 feet? What's the magic, or 30? What's happening? Why is it that number?
Yeah, so as the water is flowing through the pipe, it creates friction. And when it creates friction, it reduces pressure. When it comes to the point to where if I had that 1/4-inch piece of emitter line and I ran it for 100 feet and I had, 15 PSI at the beginning, I'm not even going to get any water at the end. It's just going to run out of, just the friction loss creates pressure loss and the water stops flowing. It's not enough to get out of the emitters.
Yeah.
So that's, it's true in your spray systems as you're setting up your turf sprinklers and so forth.
Right. So we have one more question, and is it 20 feet in total, or is it 10 out, 10 back, or is it 20 out and 20 back, 40 feet?
It is 20 feet in total. So you could go 20 out and 20 back. I like to keep it. I just work in the 20-foot rule just for simplicity's sake. But yeah, if you want to get technical and you're really designing something, you could go out and back.
Right.
And I'll tell you the other reason.
But you have to think the total length of the emitter line, right? 20 feet.
Yes. Yeah. But yeah, when it comes to irrigation, I never like to go to the maximum because there's safety. And I've done this in other presentations before. We're talking about designing an irrigation system. Whatever the max is, cut it in half. And that's just been a rule I've always followed. There's some safety there with that. So.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah. But now you guys all know, and you can make your own choice of what you want to do there. And again, so when we're coming to the annuals and perennials, here's the product that are involved. You can use 1/2 inch, as you see on the left, this total CV. Most of the time, you're going to use the mini pep line that can be in black or brown, and of course the staples to keep it plugged down.
You know what I love about this, Andy, is it's simple.
Yeah.
A lot of people say, oh, it's so complex. I feel like I'm putting Tinker Toys together or whatever. There's so many pieces, but this really simplifies it and makes it easy to, like you say, flip it out, do whatever you need to do, and flip it back in.
Yeah. What's interesting, irrigation sometimes can be very intimidating, but it is, there are some simple, just very basic fundamental principles that once you understand that, you can apply it to every scenario and it begins to make sense. And that's why, for some of you who are, maybe expert in irrigation, you're looking at this thinking, well, yeah, we've talked about this principle in several different applications. It sounds like a repeat, but it really is. It is. There's just some simple fundamental practices that once you understand, you apply it to different scenarios across the board, and you'll see that here in our next section, right? So we have turf. Did you know? I know everybody knows it. Yeah, yes, you can. You can irrigate turf using subsurface drip. Similar principle going back to our vegetable bed and our flower bed. This is, an area where we need to apply a uniform amount of water across the entire area. If you didn't think of turf as one organism, but a bunch of tiny little plants, which is really what it is, really very tightly spaced together, an 1/8 of an inch apart or 1/4 of an inch apart, that's what we have going on with turf. And so we follow that same principle of we need to spread that water evenly across the soil profile. Now, things change a little bit with turf, whereas with your flower beds, you can lay that irrigation line right on the surface. We're not doing that with turf, right? Because we got to aerate. And a quick way to ruin your irrigation system is punch a hole through it with a core aerator. So we want to make sure we're installing this emitter line at least approximately 8 inches deep. 8 inches seems to be the average. And I probably should back up, Richard. In these applications, we're using 1/2 inch emitter line. And we want to make sure we're using a pressure compensating emitter line because we want to give ourselves the best opportunity to have the same amount of water applied uniformly across the lawn area. And then that gets into a couple keys here for subsurface drip in turf. It's imperative to have a consistent soil texture throughout your irrigation zone. If you have in the same zone an area that has clay and an area that has sand, well, the water interacts differently in those areas. You'll end up overwatering in one area or underwatering another. And that's probably the biggest problem I think people have with subsurface drip for turf is inconsistency of soil blends. But if you have a consistent soil blend, which I know a lot of people, especially out west, were bringing in a topsoil, and you can get a consistent compaction, and then your texture, which is the other key. Once I know my texture, I know that I know my emitter spacing requirements, and then I know my lateral spacing requirements. I can have a lot of success. And so, I see that I've seen this used in large lawn areas, But where I find it very practical, like you see in this picture here, I call this boulevard, you know, that strip of grass between the street and the sidewalk, or sometimes you see it, you know, in parking lot medians in grocery stores or the retail shops. These tiny little areas of turf that are hard to irrigate, overspray everywhere, you know, get water spots all over the cars. You could do a subsurface drip irrigation like this in your turf and really have a lot of success with it.
Yeah. Andy, you have a guy working for you now, Dave Layborne, right? Who was really a pioneer in subsurface drip.
Yeah.
I know I've seen lots of photos of his yard, his personal yard, and he uses it and it's beautiful. And for years when we weren't working together, but we stayed in touch, I would always ask him, how's that turf looking? And there was no time in which he ever said he had problems. I know it's been a good application for him. I also have another favorite contractor in the Bakersfield area. He does a lot of retrofits for subsurface turf, drip in turf. And he'll leave the old spray system in too, and he'll have a manual valve so he can switch off the drip or put it back on the sprays. He says his customers are sometimes more comfortable making the changeover with that, you know, to mentally make that switch. And I thought for retrofits, that's not a bad idea. What do you think about that?
You know, I was just going to say, man, that is a great idea, leaving the sprays in just to maybe giving somebody the peace of mind. You know, I'm not surprised at all that Dave's having a lot of success with subsurface drip in his yard when you understand the correct principles and you get the soil engineered properly, it works very, very effectively. And like your guy up in Bakersfield is experiencing. But I like that idea. You know, I think that's man, the smart contractors out there probably taking note of that. I always like showing this picture. You know, can you imagine irrigating this area with spray? You know, it's kind of a nice artistic little effect. Not a lot of turf, but it looks nice by the pool. But this is, you know, this hopefully stokes some creativity for some contractors out there. This is a great way to use subsurface drip irrigation for turf. You know, it would be a terrible thing to spray.
On a hot day like today, Andy, I'm having a hard time not looking at the pool and looking at the irrigation.
You and me both. So products you're going to use in your subsurface drip irrigation. And before anybody says how deep is that, this was a setup shoot. It's not 8 inches deep. It was to highlight a product. But Powerlock fittings are great, and I'll tell you the reason why. Most of the time, your emitter line, half-inch emitter line, is 17 millimeters. And your header or footer, if you're using poly, is going to be a larger size. It's going to be like 18 millimeter, right? So having one fitting like this Powerlock fitting that fits both sizes, a universal fitting, becomes key. You can't do that with a barb insert fitting. You can't do that with a compression fitting. So this Powerlock fitting is absolutely necessary. Again, we have the staple. We have the half-inch emitter line. And then we're adding now this flush. Because your irrigation system is buried under the turf and you're not going to be digging it up very often, you want to make sure you're maintaining your system, and you're going to make sure you do that via a flush valve of some sort. And here I'm highlighting our automatic lateral flush valve.
Yeah, so hang on, Andy, my head's spinning a little bit. You mean everybody has half-inch tubing? I really need different fittings for different tubings? What's that about?
Yeah, well, half-inch is a misnomer. None of it is truly half-inch, but in the category we call half-inch, there's at least 4 different sizes. There's 16 millimeter, there's 17 millimeter, there's 18 millimeter, and then we switch over to inches, and we have a 0.7 by a 0.6, which is in between 17 and 18 millimeters. So there's at least 4 different sizes of tubing that we call half-inch, that the industry calls half-inch.
So if I don't know what tubing's in the ground, like if I've inherited a job and I'm a maintenance contractor and I'm rolling up and there's a problem, I have to carry a bunch of different fittings in my truck?
Yeah, that's the old way of doing it. If you want to save time and money, you buy Powerlock fittings. You stock your truck with the PL55 series of Powerlock fittings, and it's a one-size-fits-all. It fits 16, 17, 18 millimeter, and 700, 600. So you reduce the amount of material you have to carry, which is clean, but you also are going to save time in labor. So you might spend another 15 cents for the fitting, but you're probably going to save $5 in labor. You know, if you're paying your irrigation technicians, even if you're just your irrigators, the going rates, you're going to save a lot more money in labor than you are going to add in material expense.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know where else you're going to save time?
Where?
Well, I'm going to use whatever wrong fitting I had in my truck, and I'm going to make it work, right? I'm going to jam it in there. Somehow it's going to work. And then a few days later, I'm going to get the call back.
And you're doing that repair for free.
I'm going to have to go do it the right way. So that's where I'm going to save a bunch of time too with the Powerlock, is it's going to be done right the first time.
Yep. No, you're absolutely right. That's key.
Yeah. So we have a question, Andy, too, on that flush valve. Where does that flush valve go in this type of layout?
At the end of the line. So let's, well, you know, I can use this diagram here. You know, we're getting ready to kind of transition into planter beds, but assume this kidney bean shape was turf, and this box right here was my irrigation valve, my on-off valve. I would put my flush line right here at the end. Or if it was in a square grid like this, and this was the in, you know, the side closest to us was in, I could put my flush valve here at the end.
Huh. Really? I thought that's where you're supposed to just fold over the tubing and use some baling wire to wrap around the end.
You've seen that too, huh? Yeah, you know, I've seen that, and I'm always amazed to see it. I'm thankful when I see it and they at least put a 6-inch valve box around it. It's really frustrating when they just, you know, wrap it up. It's not baling wire, it's old irrigation wire, and then they just bury it somewhere out in the landscape and you have no idea where it is. But
yeah, and so then another question, you know, is the flush valve above the ground, below the ground? What do you do about that?
We install it in a box, in a small valve box. We make a little 4-inch by 6-inch bubbler box, we call it. You could put it in a 6-inch round. It's going to be at the same level as your emitter line is. So in subsurface turf, it's going to be, you know, beneath the surface. If it were laid on surface, you could you know, dig it down a little bit. I think it looks clean and sharp when it's below the surface in a box.
Yeah, and what does it actually do?
So every time the irrigation system turns on, there's a little diaphragm inside this flush valve. It opens up, and it runs for a few seconds, and any debris that's in the line gets flushed out. Now you say, well, if I have a filter, why do I need a flush valve? How is debris getting introduced? Well, two ways. Number one, if you had to make a repair, something was punctured, right, debris could be introduced that way. Number two, if you live in a hardwired environment, sometimes those deposits can build up on the inside and end up plugging the emitters. If you have the opportunity to flush those out, then becomes critical.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I love that you brought the flush valve up. It's so important to a more maintenance-free, not maintenance-free, but less maintenance on your system. And boy, they're really valuable, and they're not, you don't see them everywhere, that's for sure, but I know that's changing. And as people are learning more about drip irrigation, they're adding the flush valves, and I think they're enjoying their irrigation systems a lot more as a result.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's again, it's a time-saving device. You don't need to go out, send two guys out to the landscape, one at the valve to manually turn it on, the other one with either the baling wire undone or the cap unscrewed, turning it on, yelling back and forth, whistling to turn it off. It just takes care of it automatically. And as a contractor, that means more time to pull weeds, deadhead flowers, pick up trash that's jammed in the landscape somewhere.
Yeah, so one last question on the flush valve. This is interesting. Do you have to have a flush valve when you have check valve emitters?
Yes, that's a good question. You don't, you still need to flush your system. I mean, so I guess you're getting into, what is it, an air relief valve versus, you know, the whole air relief check valve system set up? It kind of may seem contradictory, but strictly speaking, flushing, part of good drip system maintenance is flushing your irrigation system. And I'll leave it at that.
Great, Andy, thanks.
You know, is again, vegetable beds, annual beds. Here we are into shrub beds. I know this picture is perennials, but if you had a tightly spaced shrub bed, right, we're following these same irrigation principles as in the past. And you can see here, it might be a slightly looser layout. Again, we're using 1/2-inch emitter line. It can be buried or it can be laid on the surface and covered in mulch. You can do it in a free form like the diagram I have on the left, or you could do it in a grid layout like is illustrated in this picture on the right. And we In these scenarios, half-inch emitter line is going to be the best. And we did a whole training on this several weeks ago. When do I use point source? When do I use emitter line? If you'll recall, this was the scenario where you want to use emitter line. It's going to save you a lot of time. It's going to be a lot more effective. Again, the key to remember here, your soil is going to determine your spacing and your flow. So you're going to want to know that. And again, like turf and like flower beds, it's ideal for areas that require a high distribution uniformity. And we look at the material that's involved again, we're looking at the same stuff as we were for turf. We're half-inch emitter line, Powerlock fittings, and flush valve. And staples aren't on there, but make sure you include those. Keep them, if you're not burying it, to keep it tacked down. So with that said, we're going to transitioning into shrubs out in your landscape, right? This would be kind of individual shrubs. We're getting into our non-emitter line, right? Let's say we're going to use point source. And there was this common formula, and I'd heard it many times, that how many emitters do I need for my shrub? Will follow this formula. If it's a 1 gallon size plant, it needs 1 emitter. If it's a 5 gallon size plant, use 2 emitters. 15 gallon, 3 emitters, 24-inch box, 4 emitters, right? No, my little animation. We don't want to do that. And here's the reason why. A couple days ago, I went over to our friends at Star Nursery in Las Vegas, and I took this picture. On the left, you have a 1 gallon red tip Photinia. In the middle, a 5 gallon red tip Photinia. And on the right, a 15 gallon red tip Photinia. Red tip Photinia at mature size could exceed 12, 15 feet and be 10 feet wide. And if you were to plant this 1 gallon guy and put 1 emitter on it, if it survives, it's not going to grow past that size. It's going to stay about that size. And that's not what we want, right? We're not planting shrubs to have them look the same as they did the day we implanted. We want them to mature and improve. So what to do. The key here to remember is this: the number of emitters for your shrub is going to vary from plant type, and it's going to be determined largely on the mature size of the tree. So the shrub, I'm sorry. If the mature shrub size is maybe 1 to 2 feet tall and wide, I'm probably going to be okay with just 2 emitters, because that is going to give that plant enough water to maintain its root zone for it to achieve its maximum potential as a plant, right? And you can see these diagrams I've got here across the bottom. If I go into a medium-sized shrub that might be, maybe it's a 3 to 4 feet wide by tall, and with a root zone that's approximately the same size, I might need 3 or 4 emitters to meet that size. And then when we get into large shrubs like the Photinia, you can get into oleander, silverberry, even crepe myrtle, some of these small shrubs or large trees, we really want to understand where the root zone is and then cover that entire root zone with emitters. And that could be in this diagram here, we have, there's probably a dozen point source emitters. And at that point, you may consider, well, maybe I just put down a grid or several rings of emitter line. And so when you get into these larger shrub scenarios, you're looking at point source or emitter line, if that makes sense. So the key to remember is, what's the mature size of my shrub, and irrigate it for its future growth. And you can see a couple of scenarios here, right? We have a very small shrub, and this is a stock photo on the left, comes out of our catalog highlighting our ClickTip emitter. A small, very small plant that gets by with just 1 emitter. And then we have on the right, looks small now. This is probably going to be a medium-sized shrub that needs more emitters, and it's been done with a loop of emitter line.
So Andy, I can, as the plants get bigger, I can increase the size of those rings as well. Is that what people do?
Well, and so yeah, so that brings up another good point. You have a choice when you're installing. You either irrigate it for its mature size now, or you come back and you add to it every year, little by little. In commercial landscape, it's really tough to get budget or time. I mean, you spend more doing it later, coming back, but I know companies that are doing that. I think you'll find it less expensive to do it right up front, because even if the plant, the canopy of the shrub or tree doesn't reach its mature size immediately, the roots will get out there right away. So if you irrigated a small shrub, let's say you irrigated it for a 5 foot by 5 foot area, and right now it's tiny like this one on the right, the roots will grow and fill that out and almost immediately, and you'll end up with a healthier plant overall. So again, my opinion, you can do it either way. My opinion is irrigate now for the mature size during the installation process rather than coming back and having to do it later at a greater expense.
Yeah, that's great advice, Andy. Thanks.
Yeah. So, okay, so I got a picture here I want to share. I call this the tale of two trees. Both of these trees were planted around 2008. In fact, I think the one on the right was actually planted earlier, but the one on the left I know was planted 2008. These are both Arizona ash trees. They were both 24-inch box trees when they were planted. The tree on the left, and they're both growing in similar environment, right? It's not like one's growing in turf; they're both growing in a decorative rock environment. The tree on the left has a 25-foot canopy, and so do all his brothers and sisters that were planted at the same time. This tree on the right, he's got at best a 5-foot canopy, and so do all the other trees. You can see the one back here behind him, just above that truck bed to the right. They're all the same size, about the size they were when they were planted, and they're 24-inch box. This tree is alive, but it's never really grown. And I show these two pictures because I want to highlight the importance of irrigating properly. And if we go to the next slide here, you can see this picture on the right. This is, again, the tree with the 5-foot canopy, the tree that didn't grow very much. It was installed with 4 emitters. It was a 24-inch box tree installed with 4 emitters right about the outline of the root ball. So about 4 square feet is being irrigated. As opposed to this tree, and you can kind of see in the picture, you can see this ground that was wetted. It's about a 12-foot by 12-foot grid of emitter line, which is still insufficient for that tree, but you can see, this just illustrates the difference here. And so it had 150 square feet of root zone being irrigated versus 4. And you can see the difference in what it does to a tree. Both trees about the same age, same species, within a mile of each other. And it's the difference of watering. Now, I look at this, I look at this tree on the right. I don't think anybody plants a tree for it to, look terrible. That tree is using water, right? Water is a resource. Landscape is an asset. We do not want to invest a precious resource into a valuable asset to have it decline in value over time. It just becomes a waste of water. If you're going to grow a tree, do it right and get the return on your investment, which is shade. And Richard, on a hot day like this, I'm sure you appreciate the value of a good shade tree.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's really good advice too, Andy, because they're expensive too to buy.
Yeah,
so I really want to get the most out of them because they can really be my most valuable asset on my property. But if it doesn't work out, that causes a lot of problems. That's great.
If I were looking at this from an insurance standpoint, putting a value on something in the landscape, that tree on the left, man, that's $10,000. I don't know, $10,000 replacement value for a large mature shade tree. That guy on the right, man, I could rip that out and put another 24-inch box tree in for less than $500. Yeah. So it becomes, the value of your landscape, as we're building from low value to high value. So the key here to remember is going back to what we were talking about shrubs, right? Irrigate for the future growth of the tree. Alternatively, you could come back every year and expand the irrigation system. I recommend irrigating for the future growth of the tree. Again, we want to understand the mature size of the tree, the species. Trees grow differently. They have different growth characteristics. Some trees can have a root zone, as you see on this picture on the left, that expands up to 4 times beyond the canopy of the tree. Some trees have, kind of a more of a compact root zone. So you can see on this left here, this is where we want to irrigate, right? We want to get the water out to those outer reaches of the tree. And here's bird's eye view looking down on it. Here's our tree canopy. Here's where the roots are growing out. It's this outer 2/3 of the root zone where we want to water. And as a good rule of thumb, if I know, the max size of my tree, let's say, is a, 20 feet by 20 feet, it's got a 20-foot wide canopy, and I know the root zone expands, twice beyond that. So I got 40 foot by 40 foot root zone. I want to at a minimum, irrigate 75% of that root zone for a healthy tree. So call that, a 30 foot by 30 foot, if that makes sense. And our key, the key product we're using here is going to be Emitter Line. Now, I will add a disclaimer. You could use a point source emitter and get the results, but from a practicality and cost standpoint, it makes no sense. You could, for the cost of material and the cost of labor, irrigate, again, let's go back to that 30 foot by 30 foot area we need to irrigate for that mature tree. I can do it more, more cost effective in terms of material and labor by using an Emitter Line grid, like you see on the left, or by using tree rings. Now this tree ring, of course, you imagine this expanded out 10 or 12 times, and you get the idea. But this gives you an idea of two different styles you could use to irrigate those trees.
So Andy, we've got a broad question here about drip irrigation systems in general.
Yeah.
Like Emitter Line or any of these products you've been talking about, once they're installed and installed properly, designed and installed properly, what should my expectation be for how long it should last?
Okay, so here comes the commercial. Well, it should last. You should be able to get 15 to 20 years out of your drip system. You should. The problem is there's a lot of ne'er-do-well manufacturers who, in an effort to increase profit or increase sales, they're reducing the quality of their product. And when it comes to drip tubing specifically, what that means is they introduce recycled plastics and foam fillers, and that decreases, it weakens the integrity, the structural integrity of the drip line. And so you end up with a product, and I experienced this firsthand at a contractor. We took over a brand new installed site. It was less than 1 year old, and we were having blowouts in the drip line. And back then I thought, man, all drip sucks. Only later did I learn it was a very low quality tubing. If you're getting a tubing that, like Jane, we're using 100% virgin resin, no foam fillers, nothing recycled. If you're getting a good high quality tubing, we warranty our tubing for 12 years. I think 15 to 20 years is realistic if you're maintaining it properly.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then what about upgrades to my system? Should I think maybe 20% of what my initial install cost was should be for upgrades, or do you have any ballpark numbers like that?
Ooh, I don't. It's interesting you asked that. I had a guy, several years ago, a guy who worked for HOAs. He did reserve studies for HOAs, and he asked that same question. And that's tough. Sometimes I would say at least as much as the initial install, sometimes more, just because it's easier to install irrigation on a clean construction site. Specifically in the desert environments where we're using aggregate mulch, decorative rock, because a lot of times these lines are buried under decorative rock, and it becomes a little bit more tricky to pull it up and redo it. But I would say, for budgeting purposes, it's got to be it's gonna be pretty darn close to the initial install.
Yeah. So Andy, one other question we have, do you have any tricks to help people, right? You put in subsurface drip, but you're very active in your garden, adding plants, changing them out. Your subsurface, man, I'm hitting those irrigation lines all the time with my shovel. What are some tips to help people out with this?
Well, I don't know if I'm the one to ask, because just the other day I was using the fork out in the garden. I punctured my emitter line, and I didn't know it until the irrigation ran. And of course, it was running at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I got the Bellagio fountains. I have a lot of power locks on hand, because that's what I did. I went out and I cut out a little section, put a power lock in there, and it was a 2-minute fix. Yeah. That's tough, especially if you're active in your garden, you're digging all the time, you're bound to hit those lines. Tread lightly. That's what I've learned to do. I don't go out with the large spade anymore. The fork. I'll use a little plastic hand trowel, and then or maybe being out there enough, I kind of know where the lines are. I know where I can dig and can't dig. But that's that's true for. But you need to be careful out there anyway, because not just your drip irrigation line. You can have main line irrigation if you get deep enough, right? If you're digging deep enough. You could have low voltage wiring for your landscape lighting. You could have other buried things. I think it's just a good idea in general to know what you have there, approximately where it is, and then tread lightly.
Yeah, those are good suggestions, Andy. A couple others that I use when I first install my subsurface, I take a lot of photos. I try to put a signal plant in one area so that I know, okay, my drip line runs just at the top of this plant. And then I try to keep my line straight and I measure to the next line so that again, in my head, when I'm looking, I can say, okay, 12 inches more from my signal plant, I've got another line. So it's a couple tricks I use. I know everybody's got their own tricks.
Yeah, and I can tell you, going back to commercial landscape days, I know crews in the field, if we knew there was a poly drip line, you know, usually in the top couple inches, and we knew we were probably going to hit it. Sometimes it was cheaper just to hit it than to slowly dig around it because the repair was so much easier than it was in time wise. So for the contractors out there, of course, they probably already know that, but that just becomes a practical side of the business at times. So. You know, I wanted to, as I was going through this presentation, go from, you know, low value up to high value and end with trees being high value components of the landscape. Now I want to end with this picture. This is a tree. This is in Great Basin National Park in Nevada. Was there a few weeks ago. They say it's the least visited national park in the country, but boy, it sure was crowded when I was there. But up near Wheeler Peak, around 10,000 feet, 11,000 feet, you get these bristlecone pines. This is a bristlecone pine that's 4,700 years old. And to put it in perspective, this tree was 200 or 300 years old when the pyramids were being built in Egypt, if I remember my history correct. This tree was already, you know, 2,700 years old when the New Testament events were being written about. Trees are an amazing, impressive thing to see. And I know not every tree is 4,700 years old, but Richard, out in your area, I'm sure you got some oaks that are 300 to 400, 500 years old. In Northern California, the redwood trees. You know, this plant material that we have the privilege to work with every day as gardeners and landscapers, it is truly, truly amazing. It can be a huge beneficial impact on our lives when we take care of it properly. And, you know, irrigation is key to all that. And I think of all the trees I've planted throughout my life, I always remembered this tree I'm planting today is going to provide shade to somebody down the road. And I hope when I'm long and gone and past, my children are old and gray, I hope that tree is still providing shade for somebody. And that can be the case if we just follow some simple basic irrigation principles.
Wow, pretty powerful message, Andy. You know, that emotional attachment we have to our plants and our trees and our landscapes in general. And this is a really great reminder. Well, listen, you've done a fantastic job today, as usual. Andy, you never disappoint. I always learn stuff from you. So that is great. Thank you. Thanks to all of our listeners and viewers today. Here's Andy's information up on the slide. I know that if you have any further questions, feel free to email him or call him. I think that's 702-600-8911. Yeah, okay, yeah. I did remember it. So Andy, thank you. Thanks to everybody. And don't forget, check us out on the podcast. That might be a nice way to listen and learn as well. So thanks everybody. And Andy, thanks again. Have a great day.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you.